Boldwood presents The Island Cottage, written by Jane Lovering and read by Rose Robinson. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. I had always thought seasickness could be overcome by powering through and keeping one's eye on the horizon. After all, the sensations were only caused by eyes and brain being out of sync. A state of mind, not as though one was actually ill. But as the low cliffs of the unpicturesquely named Scrabster began to fade into the blue-grey of the sea, and the boat rocked, dipped and twisted underneath my feet, to make simply standing still feel like trying to climb stairs whilst drunk in high heels, I realised what everyone had meant by the advice, "Stay on deck if the crossing is rough." The sea wasn't even that rough, apparently, relatively speaking. A crowd of chatting local women who had, involuntary eavesdropping told me, been on a trip down to Edinburgh, were gossiping about how lucky we were that the early May weather was so fine and the sea so good for the journey home. I, meanwhile, held on to the rail and my breakfast on the bucking bronco of a boat and tried not to listen in on their conversation. All this time, the islands grew on the horizon like flat grey mushrooms forming out of the surrounding cloud. Orkney. A place that had existed in family tales and wildlife programmes featuring well-scrubbed men in large coats. A place I had never thought about and had certainly never intended to visit. A place I was now bound for, with a car full of cleaning equipment and a feeling of impatience that almost forced the seasickness into second place. Orkney. I mean, why? Obviously, I knew why I was here, to clear out my great aunt's cottage, put it on the market and leave. But the whole thing... The ship reared again under my feet, dropped one corner into an oncoming wave and nearly toppled me over the rail. Was so ridiculous that I was in two minds about not disembarking and simply staying for the return trip. I didn't have the time for this. My mother, who had guilted me into the journey, didn't realise that I had work. Clients. People relying on me to sort out their accounting problems resulting from the April tax year end and to argue with HMRC about allowable expenses. The phrase, "But you haven't had a holiday for 3 years and you're starting to look a bit peaky," had worn me down, eventually. Plus, she'd bribed me with the promise of the money from the sale, and I'd been saving for my own place for so long that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like not to share a bathroom with 2 other people. The ship bucked again. People around me were pointing and exclaiming about cliffs and that we were passing Hoy, but I couldn't see anything to get worked up about, other than the fact that our destination was now in sight. Land, a flat green scab in the ominously grey sea, looking windswept and deserted. Oh, bugger. I pulled my coat closer around me as the persistent wind tried to throw me overboard. Maybe I should have taken up my housemate's offer to borrow her full weatherproof walking gear and long johns, because my sensible black jacket wasn't doing anything to keep out the draft, and everyone around me was dressed as though they were off an Arctic trekking experience. Even the more obvious tourists, who were exhausting themselves taking photographs of every rock and stone we thrummed past, were well wrapped up. Orkney. Oh, bugger. Chapter 2. You take the road to Evie. It's more of a district than an actual place. My mother's instructions echoed in my head as I steered my way up the hill and away from Stromness, the hodgepodge of buildings that clustered around the ferry port, all of them seemingly gazing anxiously out to sea in search of escape. I mean, I would have gone myself, but there's your father. She'd broken off here as though my father was my fault. We'd never manage his chair in those places. I drove down a narrow lane with passing places, and thought that, damn her, she'd been right. Because of my father's wheelchair, they had to drive about in a van so wide you could have used it to transport Shire horses. Hence, sending me on this errand. That had meant taking a couple of weeks off work, unpaid, because I hadn't been able to get holiday leave at such short notice, to tidy up and market a house that had been empty and deserted for 50 years. But sale of said house would mean money to buy myself somewhere. Somewhere convenient for helping them out, of course, as they relied on me so much. A nice flat, maybe, in the old converted chocolate works. I'd seen a 4-page spread in the paper. Glossy photographs of wonderful views, bifold doors onto balconies, double-height ceilings and colour-matched bathroom fittings. Overlooking the city walls and only a short walk from the centre. Was that it? I'd whipped past a turning, but half caught sight of a nameplate attached to a wobbly look. It was a large and impressive house just off the road, with a wide gravelled drive leading to it, and I felt my spirits start to rise a little. Aunt Jennet's house didn't look at all as though 50 years of neglect had affected it. All the windows had curtains hanging neatly, not tattered or mostly cobweb. The place seemed clean and cared for, standing on the slight rise of slope with the glint of sunlight shining on a stretch of water behind it. Wow. Maybe we owned a loch. Mum hadn't mentioned a loch. But then, by her own admission, she hadn't been here since she was small, when my grandmother had parcelled her, Uncle James and the cat, William, into a car and driven off to Glasgow to raise her family somewhere you could stand upright during the winter, as Grandma had always said, grimly. None of them had ever come back for more than casual visits, leaving Great Aunt Jennet and a handful of miscellaneous great-uncles, second cousins, and other assorted relatives to carry on farming, fishing, and doing whatever people did to scratch a living on Orkney in the late 60s. From the looks of the place, that had been making wax effigies and burning incomers, I thought, turning in through the gate and bumping the car over a cattle grid that had weeds poking up through it, as though it formed a prison for monstrous greenery. Close to, the house proved to be a long, low building, but with a double-storey extension to the side nearest the road, all white-painted, as though to try to bring some light to the area. Beyond it, the grassland sloped down towards the shores of a small loch, where a tumble-down boathouse stood, almost in the water and covered in ivy. Above everything, the sky stretched like a taut white hospital sheet, unbroken to the horizon. There were no trees, which gave the whole place an exposed look, but it seemed unashamed. It was the exposure of the life model posing for a painting, rather than that of a bather who's had their towel ripped away mid-change. I parked beside the house and got out. Immediately, the front door whipped open. A woman leapt out as though she'd been leaning against the door, and it had popped open, precipitating her sharply onto the shingly patch, which seemed to stand in for garden. "And you must be Brid." The way she said it, as though we were in the middle of a conversation, disconcerted me. I had no idea who she was, how she knew my name, or even if I was in the right place. She pronounced my name properly, which made it sound as though people wanted to say Bridget but had swallowed the last syllable. Of course, being called Brid hadn't done me any favours at school, but then neither had being taller than every other girl in the year, good at maths and wearing sensible shoes, so my name had really been the least of it. "Is this Midness?" I asked, although from here I could see the sign on the gate quite clearly. It wobbled in the wind, a waggled certainty of locality. "And yes, I'm Brid Harcus." The woman was tugged closer by the wind. She was about my age, or slightly older, I thought, maybe edging into her mid-30s, but the very fair skin that accompanied her red hair looked dry, and the wrinkles may have been premature, so she could have been as young as 25. "I'm Innes. Oh, come in, do. The wind would have the skin off your back out here." From inside the house came the sound of ferocious arguing, ending in a rising wail, and a small toddler of indeterminate sex bundled out through the door and clasped the woman around the lower legs, hiding its face against her knees. Without acknowledging the new arrival, Innes turned and began to lead me into the house, having to drag one leg with the child attached, but doing so as though this were such a common occurrence that she was slightly surprised that I did not have an infant connected to my own lower limb. "Should I put the car somewhere?" I called, wavering hesitatingly between not wanting the car to be in the way, but also not wanting to stand out here in this horizontal wind while Innes shut the door in my face. She paused, heaving her childbearing leg over the doorstep. "It'll be fine," she said over her shoulder. "Nobody'll touch it there." A pause, and she added darkly, "You know what's good for them around here?" As around here was so deserted as to be practically barren, I took her word for it. But as she continued inside, I wondered how I was going to break the news that this place, which seemed from the noise to be home not just to her but half the population of the Orcadian archipelago, was about to be sold. I tried to think how I was going to frame the sentence as I followed Innes on down a narrow corridor to the back of the house, but couldn't come up with anything that didn't make me sound like the world's most rapacious landlord. Why hadn't my mother mentioned tenants? She'd made it sound as though Jennet's house had been deserted for years. Not bring down eviction on the head of this young woman and her 3, 4, 5 children. "Sorry, it's a bit of a state." Innes shook off the attendant toddler as she passed the small plastic table that contained the others, all crayoning determinedly, and led me into a kitchen that was secured behind a child gate. "I've not had much time to clean today." She knocked her flopping hair away from her face with the back of a wrist. Against her pale skin, her hair looked even more auburn in here, where the small window let in not a lot of light, but an even clearer view of the loch. "It's fine." I felt compelled to reassure her, whilst still working on the way to tell her she was homeless. "Really? You must be busy with all those children." Innes bustled over to the kettle and switched it on. I was mildly reassured that it was electric, and she didn't have to lay a peat fire or something. I hadn't really done a lot of research into Orkney before I came, and I'd had a vague image of cast-iron ranges and a lack of mains power. The fitted kitchen with microwave, large cooker and recessed lighting made me feel stupid and unprepared, as did the presence of Innes herself, and I was inwardly cursing my mother's, "You'll only need to be there a few days, a week or so at most. Put the place up for sale and then you can be back." The rest of her sentence went unspoken, but it ran mostly along the lines of, "Besides, you need a holiday. You never get away from your job, and yes, I know accountancy is important, and you're busy, but you do need to stop working sometimes, and not just to run me to the supermarket." It would then be followed by observations on my being too thin or too pale or not having a nice boyfriend and an old rectory in the countryside, which was my mother's life plan for me. "Oh, the kids aren't all mine." Innes turned back from the kettle and caught me looking at the kitchen. She smiled. "Only that one there." She pointed to the throng of toddlers, but I couldn't see which one she was indicating. "The grubbiest one." Innes grinned, and it was a friendly, open smile that made me feel guilty for assuming that all islanders lived like medieval peasants. "Are you running a kidnapping racket?" I asked, slightly unsettled by her smile. She seemed to know that I was suffering from culture shock. But when the parents don't turn up on time for collection, I'm fairly tempted to start ransoming the buggers, let me tell you. Ah. Okay, so not only was I going to have to break it to her that she was going to lose her home, she was also going to lose her business. Mother, I am going to kill you. You'll have come to sort out Jennet's place. Innes set out 2 mugs and fetched down a biscuit tin. The rattle of the lid coming off drew the assorted toddlers to the child gate, where they thronged with arms reaching through the metal like a junior episode of The Walking Dead. Jennet's place? I asked. It seemed an odd way to speak about her home. Aye. Innes looked at my face and smiled again. Oh, you were thinking that this was the house? She poured water into the mugs, put a few biscuits onto a plate, then took the tin over and handed out the remains to the starving horde, like a Victorian lady distributing largesse. Well, I was just wondering where it was. I lied. I already felt displaced and unsettled, and it made me feel a little as though Innes was mocking me for my misunderstanding. I doubted that this was intentional. Her tone was gentle, and I gave myself a stern talking to. My cultural misapprehensions were not her fault. My mother didn't really prepare me very well. It's a short-notice trip. I felt safe confessing this much. We thought it might be. She pushed a steaming mug towards me. Here, cup of tea and a biscuit. We've moved on a bit past the spring water and oatcakes era now. So, she knew exactly what I'd been thinking about Orkney. That was embarrassing too. I was so clearly at a disadvantage here, when I'd been assuming that I was going to ride in like a technologically advanced being to the poverty and backwardness of an isolated society. A bit like finding an undiscovered tribe in the Amazon and realising they'd invented time travel. I'm sorry, I said humbly. I should have done more research, but Mum has decided that there's no point in keeping Jennet's place. My dad has MS and can't travel, so they're never going to come here, and my work keeps me in York, and what with property prices going up and everything. I tailed off. Innes turned away to look out of the little window. Definitely. Well, yes. Her tone of almost suppressed eagerness surprised me. By the way, these biscuits are good. From behind me, the sound of toddlers fighting over crayons broke out, accompanied by more wailing. You might be in for a bit of a shock. Innes put her cup down. It's not exactly Buckingham Palace down there. She climbed over the child gate with the air of one going over the top at the Somme. Not going to make you millions. We're not after millions. I raised my voice to carry to her over the sound of squabbling being sorted out. It's more about getting rid of it. Mum says it's been a thorn in her side since Grandma left it to her, and she never really understood why Grandma didn't sell it ages ago. Freya, let Archie have the blue one. No, that's a red one. Give him the blue one. Finn, you give the biscuit back to Ava. That's a good boy. Innes was monologuing to the infants, and I wasn't entirely sure she'd heard me until she waded back, bearing a packet of confiscated crayons. So, you just want a quick sale and away? Basically, yes. It may take a wee bit longer, it's in a bit of a state. It began to dawn on me that I hadn't booked anywhere to stay on Orkney. I'd been assuming that Jennet's cottage would be habitable, and I'd be staying there while I tidied up and put it on sale. Innes, however, was beginning to make it sound as though I should have brought camping equipment, and possibly a flamethrower. From the portentous nature of her tone, a sturdy pair of Wellingtons and a working knowledge of damp courses might not go amiss either. But I'm sure you know what you're about. Was that a smile, half seen as she turned away? It was quite obvious that I had absolutely no idea what I was about. Innes could see my floundering unpreparedness, but at least she was being kind about it. "Oh, that'll be the men back," she said, jerking her head up at the sound of a vehicle. "My husband Torstein and his brother." She refilled the kettle. "Back from weaving fishing nets out of seaweed and slaughtering herring with their teeth." This time, the grin she gave me was pure mischief. "And if you believe that, you're more southerner than I took you for." I laughed. What do they really do? Another tin was taken out of the cupboard. I noticed the LED lights inside the doors. This kitchen was better than mine. "Mixed farming. We've got 30 acres spread over the land here. We're dairy and there's a few sheep, bit of hay, and a few acres to oats. Magnus helps out and he makes jewellery over in Kirkwall. They're back from evening milking just now. A bit early, because we've only got the 10 cows in milk at the moment." A couple of thick china mugs joined Innes's and mine on the table, and the boiling water hit the tea bags at exactly the same time as the kitchen door opened and 2 men walked in. It was so beautifully timed that I could only imagine that this was how it went every day. Another biscuit tin was fetched from a high shelf, and the lid levered off in an almost choreographed way. "Whose is the wee car outside?" The biggest of the men, all shoulders and hat, immediately turned to the sink and began to wash his hands. "We've never got another lost tourist." "No, it's Mary Ellen's girl. Come to sort out Jennet's place and sell up." "Oh?" Both men turned to face me now. Torstein was, presumably, the big-shouldered one, which left Magnus as the taller but slighter of the two. Torstein had hair as red as his wife's. Magnus was dark, although his fair skin and hazel eyes showed that he was probably just a more concentrated shade of auburn. The entire family looked as though they could be annihilated by the sun, like vampires. Magnus smiled first. "You'll be finding all this a bit strange, then?" He came over and pulled out a chair to sit opposite me at the little table. "As you've not been before?" His accent wasn't as strong as his brother's, more a sing-song intonation around the vowels, as though his voice had been ironed by another influence. "How do you know I've not been here before?" I bridled slightly at his words, even though they were mild and not as insulting as I was assuming. "We'd have seen you." His brother came in now, seizing a biscuit in each hand and going to the gate to greet the small girl Innes had called Freya with an absent-minded kiss on the head. "Why would you come if not to see Jennet's place? And it's away down the loons there." He pointed with one of the biscuits. "Unless you crouch down, and that would just be strange." "Aye, but she could have gone round the loch. Come at it from the other side," said Magnus reasonably. "After dark." True. Torstein seemed to give this "Oh, yes, very creepy." They stared at me again. "Well, I didn't," I said, with rising confusion. "I haven't ever been here before, let alone sneaking around after dark." Innes laughed suddenly. "They're teasing you, Brid. We knew you were coming, you see." Aye, it was written. Magnus looked at me over his cup of tea. "Your coming was foretold." "Shut up, you wee bastard." Innes slapped his arm. "You're upsetting the lass." I must have looked completely out of my depth, because I felt it. Confused, tired, wrong-footed, and now they were making my arrival sound almost biblical. The babble of toddler chat, over which we had to raise our voices, and the local accent, soft though it was, meant that I was struggling to comprehend what was happening here, which wasn't fair. This was supposed to be a 3-4 day clear-out old house and put it on the market drive-by. I cursed my mother again. Sorry. Magnus pushed the biscuit tin across the table towards me. Innes is right. I am only teasing. But I'm right too. It was written that you'd come. Your mother sent an email a couple of days ago. Well, that explained how Innes knew who I was and why I was here. Why don't you take Brid down to Jennet's place now? Innes grabbed a damp cloth and sorted her way back into the toddler corral, where she began laying about her, wiping sticky faces and hands and gathering crayoned pictures into a pile. This lot will be up for a collection in a minute, and Brid doesn't need to have to be introduced to half of mainland when she's only just arrived. Oh, yes, please. I put my mug down. After all, the sooner I got this started, the sooner I could be back on that ferry and home. Hopefully, with an idea of how soon and for how much we could get the place sold. One step nearer that new-build flat with the designer kitchen and view over the Minster. Aye, when I've finished my tea, Magnus said, equably, scooting his chair back on the tiled floor to make room for his brother to sit alongside him. Both of them dipping their hands in the biscuit tin again. The yells of small children, the bright, modern kitchen, and the low burr of Torsten and Magnus as they talked about goose, blurred behind a foreground daydream of home. Well, not home, because that was currently a small rented house near the... but the home I wanted. The home that I knew I could make. That magazine supplement picture of the converted chocolate factory floated before my eyes again, overlaid a touch by my own choice in interior decoration. Plushly comfortable furniture, pale carpets and a farmhouse-style pine table, taking pride of place in an open-plan kitchen, polished daily by a diligent cleaner who would also hoover the stairs and bring fresh flowers once a week. Or, if Jennet's place was nice enough, and I could sell it to a holiday rental company, maybe I could buy a historic cottage in town. The image changed to me greeting visitors on the doorstep of a charmingly aged house with a view of the river, leading them through into a beamed-ceilinged room full of tasteful sofas and copies of Country Life magazine. Then I saw myself bending over an Aga as I created taste explosion dishes whilst my visitors drank coffee from a bean-to-cup machine on an exquisite sideboard. Right, you ready? Magnus was on his feet now. We'll go on down the brae to the house. Have you got any boots, lass? Boots, I repeated, still half in my fantasy white-furnished world. I might have a pair in the car. I'd been thinking of my leather boots, which went perfectly with the floaty, calf-length skirt and silky knit cardigan that I had brought for evening visits to any local pubs that might arise. Aye, it's a wee bit wet down there. Boggy, you know. And you can't drive down, so we'll have to carry your luggage. Innes, can Brid borrow your spare wellies? I wasn't sure I liked Magnus's half-raised eyebrow and slight smile. It looked as though he knew perfectly well that I wouldn't have packed Wellingtons, that I didn't even own Wellingtons, and he was grinning to himself at the thought. Innes called back an affirmative, and Torsten went to help her sort out the toddler tangle, so Magnus and I went out of the back door, where the wind began to have another go at my head. Is it always this windy? I asked, stepping into the pair of remarkably robust boots that he indicated, lying by the step. They had little ducks on the ankles. He, I noticed, was wearing a pair of leather boots that looked as though he'd had them fitted by a farrier when he was 14 and hadn't taken them off since. He'd also got on a pair of overalls with a torn front pocket and an ornamentation of green stains that looked as though milking had also featured more. Och no. Magnus waited for me, leaning his long frame against the house wall. Sometimes we have storms. He grinned again. I slithered my feet into the boots, which, by the feel of it, were at least 2 sizes too big, and squeezed my lips together. This man seemed to be deriving no end of pleasure from my lack of preparation for Orkney and my absence of any prior knowledge. Well, I thought, as we began to walk away from the house and down towards the reeded glitter of the loch, I'd like to see how he got by in York, with the traffic and the vagaries of the ring road and parking, and people constantly needing either reassurance or to be chased for essential paperwork. I bet he'd struggle with having to drive over to visit parents at the end of a long working day, with having to sit in an overheated living room, listening to Mum talking about the soaps. I bet Magnus didn't know what it was like to spend ages in the garden pulling weeds, while Dad sat in his chair and tried to teach me to tell vervain from verbena. Magnus looked as though he hadn't even had parents. He looked like someone grown in the black local soil, like a person who had farmed forever, whose life had always been this bleak, treeless place, and who took for granted striding along in big boots over mud that bubbled. I felt very alone. Why was I even here? Mum and Dad needed me, which was why I went around every evening. Work needed me. Well, I needed work too, so that was fair enough, but... oh, bugger. Chapter 3. We didn't speak on the way. Magnus trod confidently over tussocks of grass that caught at my feet and made me trip in the oversized boots, which held a trace of someone else's sweaty, damp socks. Between the tufts, the ground was suspiciously bright green, and the wind bent anything longer than a few centimetres into a supplicated curve. After a minute or two, Magnus stopped. "This is where Jennet's property starts," he said, although there was no visible border. Except, looking down at my feet to stop the renegade wellies from catching in another clump and tripping me forward yet again, there was something lying on the ground. A little twist of stalks bound together with more of the same. Grey ears of barley, long eroded by weather into damp husks and weighted down by a large rock. They could almost have been carried in by the wind, except that even all the barley would still be not much more than green sprouts this far north, and the way the bundle was tied together looked deliberate. As did the placing, in the lee of the large tuft that had caught my boots, and with the stems under the rock. What on earth is that? I bent down to pick up the soggy bundle, but Magnus put out a sudden hand. "I wouldn't touch it," he said. "Not yet." I looked sideways at him to see if he was joking or deliberately trying to scare me by imbuing a simple local custom with Blair Witch vibes, but he looked serious enough. The wind was pulling his dark hair back and making his face seem bleak and exposed. "Why not? It's just a bit of old corn." A hesitation. Because I was watching his face, I could see the small frown that crossed it, and then the way he raised his eyes from the ground to look over at the overgrown heap of stones that lay between us and the eye-watering brightness of the loch. "Better that you don't," he said, and his words sounded careful. "Not just now." Then he turned towards me, and there was an expression that I couldn't read somewhere between the brown eyes and the straight mouth. It almost looked as though he felt sorry for me, but not in a towny, clearly unprepared for the countryside way that he had when he'd mentioned borrowing Innes's boots. This was more of the sadness of the guard marching the prisoner to their execution. "Right," I said firmly. "I am not having this. I've come to sell Jennet's house, not to take part in some amateur Lovecraftian reconstruction." And I bent down and picked up the soggy clump of straw. Magnus breathed in with an audible hiss, but didn't try to stop me this time, as I shredded the barley into the wind, letting the wet husks float away. "There. Now, if you're going to tell me that I've just brought bad luck on the entire family, you're probably about 20 years too late." I ostentatiously wiped my hands free of the detritus down the legs of my jeans. "And I'm not having anything to do with superstitious rubbish." The wind cried, caught in a corner of wall, and pummeled the ivy-covered stones in front of us, so the growth undulated and billowed, as though the concealed building exhaled. "So there," I added, slightly less stridently, because Magnus's silence was beginning to lead me to believe there was an asteroid on its way towards my head. After a moment or two of his watching me whilst wearing an unreadable expression, but one from which any trace of pity had vanished, he shrugged. "Ah, well," he said. "It was probably just one of the children playing out here and sticking some rubbish under a stone anyway." "Do you do this on purpose?" Needled, I set off again in his footsteps as we continued our trudge across the wet field. "Or is it because it's me? Like psychological warfare?" He stuck both hands in the pockets of the dungaree overalls. "The tourists expect a bit of the old woo," he said mildly. "We have to be a bit unearthly out here, otherwise they'd all up and head back to Edinburgh or Stirling, where there's Marriott hotels and pipers and people say "och aye" on purpose." "Well, I am not a tourist," I said tartly. "I'm a landowner, and both my mum and my dad were born here on Orkney, so I'm not exactly some incomer either." "Ah, I wondered about that." Magnus led the way to a stone-flagged path that crossed the remainder of the bog as far as the cottage. Actually, path was putting it strongly. It was a series of paving stones laid end to end, but there its resemblance to anything that could be found anywhere other than this bleak field stopped. "Your first name is, what, Irish? But Harcus is a good Orcadian name." He looked at me over his shoulder. "You're a bit of a crossbreed." "I'm named after Dad's mum," I said stiffly. "She was from Limerick." "So you're a Gaelic lass through and through, then?" Magnus seemed to find this amusing for some reason. "I suppose so." "But you're an accountant in Yorkshire." I pursed my lips at him. All the sword dancing and leprechaun wrangling jobs were taken. It was accountancy or the bra department in Marks and Spencer. Now he laughed. It made him look a bit less brooding and less of the lean, well-worn farmer, although it didn't make those dungarees any more palatable. "Aye, well, we'll see what you think to the cottage, then." I might have imagined his follow-up words, because the wind was in my ears and I'd just stepped off the path and nearly lost a boot to the sinking mud, but it definitely sounded like... He's trying to frighten me off, I thought. Weird things woven from straw left lying around, dark hints about the area, the whole Poe impersonation. I wondered why. What they could possibly stand to gain from me running screaming back to the mainland, throwing my hands in the air and swearing never to set foot on this haunted land again. Oh, apart from the fact that their house was about a quarter of a mile away on the same stretch of land, and if I had to make a quick sale, they might just score a few acres of farmland for a very cheap price. "Right. This is it. Magnus held out a hand and indicated the creeper-covered stretch of wall. Are you ready? Do you say the magic word and the undergrowth parts or something? I still sounded sharp. No, I unlock the padlock and we open the door, Magnus replied, his voice level and showing no sign of taking offence. Like civilized folk. He dug in the front pocket of his overalls and pulled out a key. We've kept the place up for you, so the roof's intact, and Innes and Torsten put in electricity and connected the place to the septic tank when they built the house. He fumbled in the undergrowth for a moment and revealed a silver padlock, shiny and obviously well maintained. So it ought to be habitable, if nothing else. Nothing else? What else was there? It was a house. Habitable was practically its only job. I wasn't expecting it to produce a Broadway show. I was now bordering on rude, I realised. Sorry, I'm tired, and this is... I waved a hand, although I wasn't sure what this was meant to indicate, other than more plant life. Odd, I finished. Is it now? Magnus fiddled a bit with the padlock. It's just a house, Brid. A bit more fiddling, and then he held back an armful of finger-like woody tendrils of growth to reveal a door hidden deep among them. And probably earwigs. Do you mind earwigs? He gave a hearty shove with his shoulder, and the door moved inwards reluctantly with the squealing sound of wood over stone. The gap was dark, and what little light got between Magnus, the ivy, and the door showed me nothing but a wooden bucket just inside. After you. I hung back. Is there... Magnus stood patiently, the padlock now bulging his top pocket. Like what? We've no leopards here in Orkney. Spiders? Oh, we have those. But Innes will have been in this last day or so to put things right, and she's a devil for the spiders. You'll be fine. Nothing wrong with a few spiders, anyway, he added. Now, get on in. It's dreek out here, and I need to show you where everything is so I can get off home. Home? For some reason, I'd assumed that he lived around here, near Innes and Torsten, and felt that dislocation again. I was struggling badly, seeing this group as a cross between the Waltons and banjo-strumming swamp dwellers, rather than people with actual real lives. As though he knew this, Magnus smiled and waved me inside. As I passed him, I noticed that he smelled of something else, underneath the cow dung. A fresh, attractive scent that took him out of the unwashed labourer league, and made me think of the slender, well-dressed men who stalked the city streets and prowled the bars. The kind of men I was more used to. The small business owners and the self-employed IT lads, carefully shaved and with their voices modulated out of their native Yorkshire accents, who emailed me sheaves of paper and panicked about allowable expenses. Why on earth should Magnus remind me of them? And why would a milking assistant on a farm even need to smell nice? My footsteps hesitated, and I half stopped in the doorway. Magnus stood beside me, pushing the door open against the resistant thrust of the creeper, which seemed to be trying to drag it closed again. And when I looked at him, he was watching me with an expression which seemed partway between amused and pitying, so I decided not to ask whether the cows appreciated the aftershave. Anyway, that brief, nose-pleasing smell of spice and citrus was gone now, and all I could smell was the rank bitterness of torn ivy. I could only assume that Innes, on her rumoured cleaning visits, opened the door just wide enough to slide in sideways. The black doorway, ripped from the leafy wall, was slightly forbidding, and I wouldn't have blamed her at all if she'd gone in with a crucifix and a flaming torch. Well then. Magnus waited for me to step over the threshold before he spoke. What do you think to the place? I don't know, I can't see it. Do you not believe in windows up here? The darkness inside the building was total. The only illumination was the blackness smelled of old beds. We might not believe in windows, they let the weather in, but we have a firm and abiding faith in electricity. There was a click, and an overhead light went on, illuminating a dim circle of room, cluttered with furniture and junk. Is that better? There was a great sense of relief in being out of the wind, even if that did mean being in what looked more like a stable for an upper-class horse than a house. Are you going to give me a tour? I asked, when Magnus carried on standing in the doorway. No point. This is it. He waved a hand. Oh, no, there's a wee kitchenette through that doorway there. He pointed into the gloom. And the toilet is off the kitchen. His hand waved again, a little more generally. As I said, the place got connected to the tank when we built the house, so you'll not have to worry about emptying the bucket. This is it. I swiveled round to find Magnus leaning against the inside wall now, almost as though his body was too tired to support his head without outside help. He was grinning. I thought this was the hallway. You were expecting to walk through into a mansion? He folded his arms. And what would Jennet want with a big house? This suited her. I could feel the dreams of a smart flat in a converted factory draining away as fast as the hope of a quick sale. From what I could see as the bleak single bulb rotated overhead in the draught from the open door, the sale of Jennet's house would just about fund a room in a damp basement. And I'd probably have to share that. With rats. The bulb swung again. The ceiling was so low that the light almost clipped my forehead, and its constant movement meant I couldn't see anything properly. Everything was angles and shadows and partly lit corners of things. A fireplace, over there at the far end of the room, a stone floor, and then, as the bulb oscillated in the opposite direction, a stack of what looked like wood, a cupboard door. But, aye, there are windows, over there. Magnus seemed reluctant to move any further into the house. He was still behind me, his hand hovering close to the light switch. When I turned, I could see him outlined by the afternoon light which shone through and made it very obvious that, yes, beneath the dark, they'll have boards over them. We've been spending the last 50 years trying to stop the place falling down, and there's nothing like a broken window for letting the weather in, so we covered them all. We? I walked a very small circle, carefully still in the daylight that was sneaking in past Magnus. You're not old enough to have been doing that for 50 years. Then I stopped and looked at him. You're not, are you? It's not now that you tell me about the family curse and then crumble into ashes. He laughed. Don't be daft. No, it's a family thing. Look, Great Aunt Jennet was our great aunt too. We, you and me, are something like third cousins. When she died, she left half the land to her brother's son, Johnny, and the house and this piece of land away to the loch to her sister, Morag. It's stayed in the family. Tor and I are Johnny's grandchildren, and you're down from Morag's side. The land and the house stayed in the family, but no one has lived in here. He held out a hand and indicated the bleak little room. Since Jennet died. Because she cursed the place? I asked waspishly. Despite Magnus's faith in Innes's cleaning routine, There was a distinct odour of lack of caring about the little place. A cold, deserted sort of smell, like the dungeons in old castles or neglected sheds. Well, no, more that it's tiny and a bit shite, and there was no water or electric until we put it in, Magnus said, in a sudden blurt of honesty. So we used it to store stuff, mostly hay. He looked down at his boots, and I saw a stray stalk caught between the air inside and the wind outside, tumbling and twitching. Sometimes the feed for the sheep. In really bad weather, come to think of it. Actual sheep. I took a deep breath. My brain metaphorically rolled up its sleeves. Okay, so sale of the place wouldn't buy me a beautiful flat, not outright, but it would give me the deposit for somewhere, and with a good clear-out, a good scrub and open windows, maybe the place could be sold as a potential holiday let. I tried not to think about the lack of access, the bogland that surrounded it, and the primitive facilities. There were people who liked isolation.